to the Putting Your Business on the Map podcast. This is the podcast for land surveyors that own or want to own a small business. My name is Landon Blake. I am your podcast host. Let's dive right into today's episode. Let me start this episode with an apology to my listeners. I don't know how long it's been since I recorded the last episode. It's possible it's approaching 6 months. I never intended for that to happen. I'm trying to get back on track here. I don't want to make excuses, but I'll let you know that there's been a very serious illness in my immediate family, and that's basically why I went off the radar for 6 months. So it's been a huge challenge, and it was not completely expected, and so just my energy has been I shouldn't say my extra energy has been taken up dealing with that, and still trying to run a survey business and put food on the table. So anyways, I apologize for having such a large gap between episodes, and I'm gonna try to get back on my weekly schedule. We'll see how that goes. We're not all the way done dealing with the illness in my family, but we at least have some awareness now of what the issue is, and some things have settled a little bit. So I will do my best. Please remember, I'm working on my word whiskers, so if you see me pause or hesitate, it's because I'm trying not to say my favorite words. I just said so. That's my most favorite word in the entire universe. Please be patient with me. I will also tell you that I am going to pick a little bit of a fight in this episode, and it's not because I want to stir up controversy. It's because I believe there's a serious problem, and if you're a land surveyor that owns your own business, or you want to own your own business, you need to be aware of this problem, because it's going to have a huge impact on you and the work you do and your ability to run a business. The title of this episode is Why Civil Engineers Make Horrible Clients. And they do. They make horrible clients. Now, it's possible there are a few of you that are out there listening to this that think to yourself, oh, well, I work for a couple of civil engineers and they're wonderful clients. Congratulations. That is a blessing. Count yourself as favored by the universe. I don't think that's the common experience. And we're gonna talk about why. I think there's some legitimate and understandable reasons why civil engineers tend not to make good clients. It's not because civil engineers are evil people. It's because that's the way the incentives are aligned, and just some of the mechanics of their connection to our profession, I think, that creates some of that problem. So these are oftentimes good people. Not all civil engineers are good people, but I think most of them are. So these are good people responding to incentives and culture and just the way our professions and economy are structured. So I want to just make that clear at the top. Land surveyors respond to their incentives, and we do things like, we don't file records of survey, and we run one-man crews, and we don't train people. So, we full confession here, land surveyors are just as bad or as worse or worse than civil engineers. We also respond selfishly to our financial incentives. But today we're not picking on surveyors. Today we're picking on civil engineers. Maybe I'll do a separate episode and we can talk about some of the ways that land surveyors selfishly respond to their incentives. That would be an interesting topic. Let me give you an overview of what we're going to discuss in the episode. We're going to talk about the 4 reasons why civil engineers make horrible clients. I believe I have 4. Let me just double check. Yep, 4 reasons. I think for most of those most of the 4 reasons, I have an example or a story that I'll share with you. And then we can talk a little bit about the end, like, okay, what's the consequence of that? Once we acknowledge that situation exists, like, what do you do about it as a land surveyor? And I can tell you how we handle it here at Redefined Horizons, and you can, the goal is to get you to think about it. Now, it's possible I have a few civil engineers that are going to listen to this episode. I think that's fantastic. I hope they will take this with a grain of salt, realize some of it is a little bit of teasing and poking fun. But there are some real underlying issues here, and I hope the civil engineers that listen will listen with an open mind, and will think about, how do they buck the trend and be the type of civil engineer that is a great client. And I want to let you know, we do have 1 or 2 civil engineering companies that we work for. It's a pretty short list, but I do have some good civil engineering companies. I'm sorry, I do have a couple civil engineering companies that are good clients. Okay. What's the main premise that underlies this entire episode? Why are civil engineers horrible clients? They're horrible clients in a way that architects or attorneys or structural engineers or land developers are not horrible. All of those professions I just listed can also be horrible clients, but civil engineers have a special way to be horrible. And I also think, and not everyone's going to agree with this, but I also think the majority of civil engineers are bad clients for surveyors. And well more than half. I would say 75%, probably, maybe 80%. So, 1 out of 10 or 2 out of 10 civil engineers is going to make a good client for a land surveying company. I didn't think about this. It's not in my outline, but I would point out that this also applies inside organizations. So sometimes your internal civil engineers are your worst clients as a surveyor inside of a civil survey organization or public agency. So that can also be true. So remember that. I'm talking about standalone survey companies that do work for other outside civil engineering companies, but this could apply within organizations as well. Okay, the basic premise that underlines this episode, the basic mechanism that I think creates this problem, is civil engineers are probably our closest, the most closely related profession to land surveying. They're what I call a sibling profession. So they're like our brothers or our sisters in a professional sense. And I don't say that lightly. I think that's important. I think we have a lot in common with civil engineers, and we understand each other professionally in ways that maybe were not understood by other professions. And so I think it should create a special kind of bond, a special kind of relationship. But unfortunately, I think what happens is instead of protecting one another and working together to best meet the needs of the client and the public, I think civil engineers abuse that relationship, that special bond. But that's the underlying premise to everything that comes after this is we have this closely related profession of land surveying called civil engineering, and that closeness is the core mechanism or cause of these other problems that we're going to talk about. Now, I will add, because I know some people are probably tweaking out right now, I think lawyers are probably the next closest related profession to land surveying, which is very different. But there's a lot of land surveying that is closely related to the law and the application of the law, research of the law, understanding the law, application of the law. And so in that way, I think lawyers would be a close second as a related profession. I think that's one of the things that makes land surveying very unique as a technical profession. I don't know that there's another technical profession that has this relationship with almost a purely technical profession like civil engineering, but also a very close relationship with the legal profession. So in that sense, to some extent, land surveying may be very unique. Maybe not unique, very special as a profession. So civil engineers are our sibling profession. They are our brothers and sisters professionally. They understand a lot of our jargon. They know what coordinate systems are. They know what northings and eastings are. They understand what a parcel boundary is most of the time. They know what a digital terrain model or a surface model is. They know what a route alignment is. They can understand stationing. Most of them have some idea what survey control is and what it's for. So they understand us in a way that other professions typically don't. I think it's easier to explain a lot of surveying concepts to a civil engineer than it is to an architect or a structural engineer or a commercial real estate agent. Some of that is because of their education. So most civil engineers have some, at least one or two surveying classes, so they get some exposure in their education. And then a lot of them go to work for companies that employ surveyors, so they get exposure that way. So that's the good part, or the blessing. The blessing of having this closely related sibling profession is they understand our jargon and some of our challenges, because they face some of the same challenges we do. But the curse, the downside is it's that this familiarity creates a dangerous blind spot and a certain amount of hubris or arrogance. And you're going to see that as we work through these 4 different reasons why civil engineers are horrible clients. You're going to see that at least 2 or 3 of them are directly related to this blind spot they have that, they overestimate their own capabilities and they underestimate how difficult surveying is. And again, it's not because they're evil. It's because they're human. And it's just the way our professions are structured. And it's just human tendency. I think some of it's cultural too. I think it's in the culture of civil engineering companies, and it's in the culture of our educational institutions. This wasn't in my outline, but one of the issues we have is civil engineers tend to be more formally educated. Land surveyors tend to not be as formally educated. That's not always true, but it's kind of a general rule. And so I think that creates some arrogance and some hubris in engineers who assume that years of college education equals competence. I think if you're like me and you've been a grown-up for very long, you realize that isn't at all true, and that some of the most highly educated people you can find in our economy are also some of the most incompetent. I know that's not a politically correct thing to say, but you don't listen to this podcast because you value political correctness. So I'll just call it what it is. All right, so let's get into these 4 reasons. So the first reason why civil engineers make horrible clients is because they think they know how to survey. Civil engineers have this idea, surveying is just math. Not only is it just math, but it's easy math. It's not even calculus. It's just, algebra, geometry, and a little bit of trig. Like, how hard could it be? Like, I did trig in the 8th grade, I won the Trig Star Award when I was a high school senior. Because they have this idea that surveying is just math and it's just, running a tape measure, running a measuring tool, they think they could just be drop-in replacements for surveyors. And I run into this, I frequently ran into this kind of thinking when I worked for big civil engineering companies. They wouldn't understand why we couldn't just, go pick up a new survey technician at Home Depot where all the day laborers were. A lot of civil engineers struggle with this idea that you can't just throw a person on a survey crew or in a basement on a computer and expect them to be an excellent surveyor. It's more than just math. The other idea was, well, if we can't just pick up, somebody at Home Depot and plug them in on a survey crew, and we'll just get us an EIT, we'll get an engineering training and then, because they know how to do math, they should be able to survey. And it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. But they have this idea, surveying is just math, and you can even see it in the way the model language from NCEES is set up. That's the institution that develops our national surveying exams. It's a lot of it is very math driven, and less so They focus less on the more nuanced legal issues because it's harder to learn that and it's harder to test that. They focus on the math. This idea gets perpetuated. So what are the consequences of this idea that, engineer, if you ask most engineers, could you survey? Oh yeah, I can survey. Yeah. Occasionally you will find a civil engineer that says, no, that is way too complicated. It's not my area of expertise. Man, a lot of civil engineers think they know how to survey. I'll tell you why that's strange to me. It's always been strange to me. I don't think I could do a grading plan for a parking lot or design a canal or a storm drain system. Like, I've never thought that. I never thought, well, because I'm a land surveyor and I can run AutoCAD Civil 3D, I don't need an engineer. I can do your grading plan. I've never had that idea. But civil engineers, man, they think if they can buy a total station or a UAV, they can survey, right? They don't understand it's not about the tools. It's about so much more than the tools. And it's not about math. It's about a lot more than math. To be done well, surveying is about a lot more than just the math or the tools. So what are the consequences of believing they know how to survey? One is they undervalue our services. Civil engineers are my biggest source of price complaints as clients. I get more pressure from civil engineers to reduce pricing than any other type of client. More than lawyers, more than attorneys, more than land developers, more than real estate brokers. It is civil engineers that come to me and say, your price is too high. Is there anything you can do? Can you sharpen your pencil? Can you lower your price? The client doesn't want to pay this. And I think it's really boils down to they think they know how to do our job, and they just to some extent they're like, I'm hiring you because I don't have a land surveying license and you have the tools. And if I just had the tools and they wouldn't make me have a license, I wouldn't even need to deal with you and I could do this for half the price. Another consequence, because they think they know how to survey, is they skip critical steps. They don't do a utility mark and locate. They don't pull adjoiner deeds when they're doing a boundary survey. They don't do ground infill surveys when they're getting aerial topographic mapping. Because they just underestimate how complicated it is. They oversimplify. And so they don't want to pay for those things. I can't tell you how many times we've told a civil engineer, we need to set good permanent survey control, give you a control sheet for the plans, or this is an urban site, it's old, we need to do utility mark and locate, or this is, we can't do a record boundary here, we need, this is a deeded parcel, there's not any monuments, we need to do a real boundary survey. And I can't tell you how many times we tell our civil engineering clients that, and they come back and tell us, we're not paying for that. We're taking the shortcut. And it never works out well for the project owner, ever. It always costs more money in construction. It just always does. Always. Without fail. Another problem is because they think they know how to survey, and they think surveying is mostly just math, basic math, is they don't understand uncertainty. And the engineers deal with some uncertainty, but not in the way that surveyors deal with uncertainty. I think as a general rule, the practice of civil engineering is much more black and white. There's a specification, there's a formula, there's a principle of physics. Land surveying is much more nuanced and complicated. And so civil engineers struggle to understand uncertainty, risk, how design impacts uncertainty, why we can't always tell them where the property line is at or who owns that, who owns the alley. They want an answer. I mean, in the minds of many civil engineers, there is a right answer and a wrong answer, and they don't understand that there might not be a good answer. They just really struggle with that, in my experience, a lot of them. Now, I will say here, I think as civil engineers get older and they get some more experience, I think some of this gets a little better. Not all civil engineers, but there's a small proportion, maybe a quarter or a third of civil engineers, as they gain experience, years of experience, and they interact with good land surveyors, they begin to understand, this is more than math. And I know a couple civil engineers like that I deeply respect. And they tell me, you know what you guys do is special. And, I respect it and admire it. And I don't think I could be a drop-in substitute. So I think you see more hubris with young civil engineers as a general rule. Some of that gets better as you get older. But there are some civil engineers that will never change. They leave college with this hubris or this arrogance, and they keep it their entire careers. All right, reason number 2. Civil engineers make horrible clients. It's because they think they can apply a formula to every problem. And there's a huge amount of surveying that does not follow that rule. There is no formula. Engineers love formulas. I think it's just how they're taught in school. And I don't know, maybe if you're a civil engineer, loving formulas is a good thing. When you're a land surveyor, loving formulas can be a very dangerous thing. It's not that formulas aren't important. Pythagorean's theorem is important. The law of sines is important. The law of cosines is important. The principles of algebra are important. Principles of probability and statistics are important. Legal principles are important. But we don't have formulas. I mean, we do have some formulas. Calculating the closure of the interior angles of a polygon is a formula from geometry that we apply. But 90% of what we do, there is no one formula to apply. And I think that's a big difference. I think in that way we're much more like attorneys than we are like civil engineers. We don't always have a formula. We have to exercise nuance and professional judgment. But engineers love formulas, and this causes problems. So I have a couple of examples. We had a civil engineer that we work with, and they estimated a project they were surveying some sewer manholes. So they had a project, and it was nice and flat and wide open sky, clear, no tree canopy, no urban canyons. And so they said, all right, well, it cost us, $100,000 to survey, 200 manholes. So $500 a manhole, let's say, to survey and dip it. And so they got a new project that had, let's say, 50 manholes. And so they said, okay, this should be half, right? We can apply that same formula. So they used the first project to come up with a unit cost, $500 per manhole. And so they applied that unit cost to the second project, right? What they didn't realize is the second project was in hilly terrain, which means differential leveling was way more expensive. There was old mature tree canopy, which means the RTK GNSS wasn't suitable for rim elevations. Everything had to be shot with total station. And they ended up losing their rear end financially on this project. And the only reason I know about that is because they came to us to share some of that story. And I thought it was a great story. It was a perfect example of a civil engineer who applied a formula to a project management situation that required nuance, and it cost their company a lot of money. And another example I get all the time is I talk to civil engineers, and they'll say something like, okay, you just surveyed a 10-acre parcel for me. It was $10,000. So that's $1,000 an acre. Now you need a 2-acre parcel surveyed, so that price is $2,000, right? And I have to explain to them, no, that's not how surveying works. There isn't a price per acre formula that you can apply for a boundary survey. Maybe your 10 acres was recently subdivided, the property corner monuments were in, and all the easements were already on the subdivision map. Your 2-acre parcel is downtown. There's no survey monuments in place. I got to survey 2 blocks in each direction so I can put the boundary back in per curb splits. I got to deal with city traffic. I got to worry about the equipment being stolen, so I need an extra man to guard the equipment while I'm doing the field survey. None of the easements in the title report have been mapped. The deeds are old. So your 2-acre parcel is $20,000, not $2,000. And it is like a lot of civil engineers, like their minds explode at that point. They don't understand. They can't handle that level of complexity or nuance. Another example of this formulaic thinking, a type of formulaic thinking is, you go out as a surveyor, you do a boundary survey, and you find 2 monuments, but they're not of record, They don't have the record character. Maybe they don't fit the record distance. Maybe they don't fit the old fence line. And so you go back to the client or the project team and you say, hey, we've got an issue here. We've got some monuments, not a record, and it doesn't fit. I need to do some more work. I got to talk to some people. I got to do some more research. And the civil engineer will say something like, well, you found the monuments. That's where how hard could it be? That's where the property, you found monuments, right? That's where the line is. Well, no, maybe not. Like, what do you mean maybe not? Well, the line might not be where the monuments are at, right? Like, my brain explodes. What do you mean the line can't be where the monuments are at? That's what monuments are for. Well, sometimes, like there's a hierarchy of evidence that has to be evaluated to locate a parcel boundary. Monuments are just one type of evidence. You see, civil engineers, a lot of them they struggle with that type of nuance. They want to apply a formula. Found monuments equals resolved boundary. Like that's the formula in their head. That formula doesn't work all the time. A lot of times it works. 90% of the times it works. 10% of the time it doesn't work. So that formulaic thinking is a problem. All right, reason number 3. Engineers make horrible clients is because they're willing to cut corners. I want to acknowledge here that civil engineers are under a lot of price pressure from their clients. I think this is worse in the private sector than the public sector, but it can also be bad. But they can also face the pressure in the public sector. So they've got a client, a project owner that's pressuring them to cut design costs. And a lot of civil engineering firms we work with will cut corners to get the work from the client. And they shouldn't do that. Like ethically and professionally, they have an obligation to not do that, but they do it anyways. And so here's what happens is we get pressured by our civil engineering clients to cut prices, to cut corners. So they'll say things like, we just need a record boundary. We don't need a real boundary. We're not paying for monument preservation. We don't need permanent survey control. We only want an aerial. We don't want to pay for ground infill surveys. We don't need a mark and locate. We just want you to call 811. I mean, I could go on. We don't want to map easements. We just want the perimeter boundary. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on with all the different ways we get pressured by civil engineers to cut shortcuts on the survey. Now, the problem with that is there's a cost and a risk to that, right? So those problems tend to show up in construction. Almost always. And what happens now, if we lived in a world where civil engineers would stand up when there was a problem in construction and say, oh, you know what, this is my fault. The client pressured me, and so I cut corners, and that's why we're having this issue. That would be one thing. Engineers don't do that. When there's a problem in construction, they point the finger. They say, well, it's the surveyor's fault. There's a problem with the survey, or it's the geotechnical engineer's fault, or it's the structural engineer's fault, or it's the architect's fault. Very rarely do I see a civil engineer stand up and say, well, we were trying to save the client money, so we designed off an aerial survey instead of getting ground infill surveys where we should, and that's why there's drainage issues now. I rarely ever see that. I remember we were working with a national engineering firm. They weren't our client. We were working for the project owner directly. But they were trying to do some off-site drainage calculations because we had a really flat site. And we told them, we said, hey, you guys need to get some detailed surveys of these off-site areas so you can figure out your off-site drainage. And they came to us and said, we need to figure out off-site drainage. Well, they wanted to use the 10-meter USGS DIM for their off-site drainage. We said, this is a super flat site. You can't do that. You guys need to pay us to survey these adjacent areas to the site. Right? The engineer said, oh, the client's never going to pay for that. I assume they designed off the USGS DIM. Absolutely unacceptable, professionally negligent, in my opinion, for them to do that. One of the things that frustrates me about civil engineers is they when they're working on the private sector side, there's this pressure to cut prices. Then those same engineers will turn around on a public agency contract and they will milk that contract for every dollar because there's not as much typically there's not as much price pressure on the public side. We had a civil engineering company that was, we were on an on-call contract with two other firms. There were two survey firms, ours and another local survey firm, and there was a civil engineering survey firm from the Bay Area. And we were on this on-call contract, and that civil engineering company was just applying super intense pressure to the public agency, to the county, one of our local counties, to try and get them to issue T&M contracts. And they were a union firm, and their billable rate was, their billable rates were for crew time were double ours. And I told the county in a meeting with everybody in the room, I wasn't bashful about it. I was like, do not let that company talk you into a time and materials contract. I said, they're trying to take advantage of you. I said, make them work on lump sum. I said, we'll work on lump sum. The other survey company is comfortable working lump sum. Like, do not let these civil engineers come in here and work T&M with hourly rates that are twice as expensive just because this is taxpayer money. This is absolutely not acceptable. What that tells you is that the engineers, cut corners or don't cut corners based on financial incentives, not their ethical or professional responsibilities. Now, I'm not talking about all engineers, but I'm talking about a lot of them. So that's not professionalism. That's used car salesmen. That's being a used car salesman. That's what that is. It's not ethical. It's the opposite of ethical. Sometimes I have to look at a client and say, I am not going to survey the way you're asking me to survey because it saves you money, because it's negligent. I know it's negligent, even though you're telling me it's what you want. I'm not going to do it because I'm not going to knowingly harm you or the public or the neighbors. Sometimes you just have to look at a client and say, I can't do it the way you want me to do it. Civil engineers have a really hard time with that. They will design on a record boundary. They will design without easement mapping. They will design on an aerial survey when they need ground infill. They will design on an urban site without a proper utility mark and locate. I see it happen over and over again. Over and over. Okay, reason. Oh, I'll tell you a story. I had a story here about this. We were working on an infill land development project in one of our local cities, and the client, we got hired by the developer. So they were actually, I can't remember if our contract was direct with them. We got brought in on the project by a civil engineer I'd worked with at a different company, and he knew me and we liked each other. He knew we did good work. So he brought the project to us. I believe we were working directly for the land developer. An ALTA survey had been done for the previous owner. I think it was done as part of this sale. So I think the ALTA survey was done when our client bought. And to make a long story short, the land surveyor missed one of the easements in the title report. It was a 30-foot wide irrigation easement or 20-foot wide irrigation easement. Ran right smack down the middle of the parcel. Now, there wasn't anything there anymore. There was no pipe or ditch. So the easement was no longer being used, but legally it still existed and it was on the title report. Okay, they missed it on the original ALTA. So we got hired to come in and do a new ALTA survey and a tentative land subdivision map. We call it a tentative parcel map in California. And on the ALTA survey, we showed the easement. And the design team had already, put some buildings on top of that in their preliminary designs. Had already put some buildings on top of that easement. So we had this meeting and everybody's flipping their lid. They're like, you showed this irrigation easement that wasn't on the previous ALTA. It runs right through the middle of the parcel, and they were pissed, right? So the developer was there, the engineer was there, the architect was there. Everybody's on this video call, right? And I said, we didn't intend to throw a monkey wrench in the engine. I apologize for that. We let you guys know as soon as we could. The reality is this easement exists. It's listed in the title report. We've triple checked the deed. Like, there is a 20-foot irrigation easement that runs through the middle of this parcel. Let's talk about what we can do to resolve that issue. Get the easement quitclaimed or determine if it's been abandoned through non-use. But yelling and screaming at me isn't going to make it go away. It's there. And at one point during the meeting, one of the civil engineers that I didn't have a relationship with, but that worked at the civil engineering company said, well, the other surveyor didn't show it on their Alta. Why are you showing it on yours? And I politely told them, because the other surveyor was a clown and I'm not a clown. Don't ask me to operate like a clown. I'm not. Like, having me do a half-baked job because your other surveyor did a half-baked job isn't going to fix this. Like, at some point, like, when do you want to deal with this? You want to wait till you're trying to close financing or sell your deal, land developer, and you can't because the title company catches that there's an irrigation easement that isn't shown on the survey but listed in the title report, or the bank catches that? Is that when you want to deal with this, or do you want to deal with it right now while we still have time? And they ended up working with me, and we ended up getting an attorney. I referred him to an attorney I work with. He's a great guy, land title attorney, and we got it cleaned up. We got it cleaned up before they needed to close escrow. And so there was a solution there, right? But that was an example, that was an example of the design team just asking why I couldn't just play ball and stop being difficult. That's not what the client needed. That didn't serve the best interest of the client, though, of the project owner. All right, last reason number 4, why civil engineers are horrible clients. It's because they send contracts for signature that have toxic language and ridiculous payment terms. So, well, let me tell you, what do I mean by that? So, example of toxic contract language is, crazy indemnification language, duty to defend, I'll give my right arm in the life of my firstborn child if you get sued by anybody for any reason at any point in history. Language that requires warranties, product warranties, like I'm a contractor or providing a pump or fire safety equipment or, conduit. Like I'm not supplying equipment or materials. I'm not, building your cabinets. I'm a land surveyor. I'm a professional. They send me contracts with toxic language. They send me contracts for construction contractors, not for professional consultants. This is a professional consultant sending me a contract that isn't for a professional consultant. When they know I'm a professional consultant, it makes no sense. And then the other thing they do is they just ask for ridiculous payment terms. It's just crazy. Paid when paid if paid 9 months after we get paid. It's ridiculous. I don't know why surveyors sign contracts like that. And we don't sign contracts like that. And I know other surveyors do, because when I tell a civil engineer, I'm sorry, I can't sign your contract as it's written, they act like I'm taking food from their children. Like, what do you mean you won't sign the contract? All our other surveyors sign the contract. You know what I tell people? You know what I tell civil engineers when they say all our other surveyors sign this contract? I say, well, that's because all your other surveyors are dumb. They're foolish. They don't read their contracts. They don't understand them. Like, I'm not that guy. I'm not that surveyor. I actually read the contracts you ask me to sign. I was like, if you want a surveyor that will sign whatever contract you hand them, go find that surveyor. I'm not that surveyor. I actually read and understand contract language. So I'll give you two examples of this. We had a large engineering, nationwide engineering company come to us. We had done some work for them. And they came to us and they wanted us to do another little project for them. But it was 3 hours away, one way, 3-hour drive. And it was a little project. It was like $15,000 worth of work. So it was a pretty small project for us. And it was prevailing wage, which if you're in California, prevailing wage is a nightmare. There's a bunch of paper. It costs you $2,000 in admin time to just get set up for the payroll on a prevailing wage job and handle all the paperwork. So they asked us to look at this project for them. It was a small job. They sent us this contract that's just got all this toxic language in it. I was dealing with a different team. This wasn't the team I had dealt with before. Had all this toxic contract language, and I told them, I said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to take this job. Like, you guys you guys have toxic contract language. It's a small job. It's 3 hours away. This just isn't going to work. And he said, well, we really need you guys to take this job because the surveyor we usually contract out to in this area, he doesn't understand the project requirements. It had a spec that had to be met. They're like, you guys understand the specification that you have to meet. Our normal surveyor doesn't understand it. And I was like, yeah, that doesn't surprise me because he signed your toxic contract. So it doesn't surprise me that he can't understand the specification being required by the city. It was a city in this case. They said, you got to do something about this contract language for me. I said, we have to talk about some changes we can make. So they kicked that around for a week or two. There was some back and forth between me and the project manager. And then finally the project manager called me and said, would you get on the call with one of our vice presidents? And I chuckled a little bit. I said, sure I can. I said, does the vice president have the ability to change the contract language? And the project manager said, well, I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure if she has the authority or if that has to go through our legal team. I'm like, look, I don't need to get on the phone with your vice president if she can't modify the contract language. It's a waste of my time. And the project manager said, yeah, I know, but it's our vice president. She's vice president of civil design and in all Northern California. She's a really important person at our company. Can you just talk to her? I'm like, I don't care if she's Santa Claus or the first lady. If she can't modify the contract language, I don't have anything to talk to her about. Like, if you want me to do this survey, get me on the phone with somebody who has the authority to give me reasonable contract language. They never hired us. I don't know how they got the survey done. I don't know how. I don't know what they did, but they wouldn't hire me because they couldn't get me on the phone with somebody that could modify their toxic contract language. And that's not the first time that's happened. We've walked away from other civil engineering companies that had work that they needed to be done because we just couldn't get them to be reasonable on a contract. I'll tell you one other similar story. We had a civil engineering company come to us. I was friends with one of their licensed surveyors. And they said, hey, we've got a big job in Nevada we need some help with. It was a renewable energy project. They said, we don't have a Nevada license. Would you guys be interested in coming and doing, they were going to have us do project control and the boundary survey and the ALTA survey. All they wanted to do was come in and do the aerial mapping. So we said, sure, yeah, we can help you guys with that. So we took a look at it. It was 10 hours away from our office. So we said, hey, we can do this. It's be expensive. It's a long ways. It's a long ways from where we're at. You guys want the work done in the winter. We're at 5,000 feet. There's going to be snow. So it ended up being about $500,000 worth of work. And they sent us over their contract. They're like, this is great. This will work. We can make these numbers work. They sent me over their contract. And it basically had language in it that said, we would get paid 6 months after they got paid by the client, if they got paid by the client. So I called them up and I said, hey, these payment terms aren't going to work. And they're like, well, what's the problem with the payment terms? I was like, well, you want a $500,000 line of credit. I said, it's going to take me 4 months to do the work. Then you want me to wait 6 months. It's going to take you guys 3 months to get it billed. And then I got to wait 6 months after that. I said, that's a year. I said, I can't run you guys a $500,000 line of credit for a year. I said, who's the client? They said, oh, we can't tell you who the client is. That's confidential information. I was like, do you understand you were asking me to run a $500,000 line of credit for a year to a client I don't even know? Can you imagine walking into a bank and saying, I need $500,000. I got somebody that he's a good guy. He'll co-sign for me. And the bank says, okay, great. Bring him in. We need to meet him. Where's his ID? We need his social security number. We need his thumbprint. And you tell the bank, oh, yeah, I can't. It's confidential. His identity has to remain a secret. The bank they would laugh at you. They would call and have you arrested by the local police department. But for some reason, this nationwide civil engineering firm thought I was just going to run a $500,000 line of credit to a client I couldn't even meet. That's the definition of insanity, folks. And so we told them, sorry, we can't do the work. We turned it down. It was $500,000 worth of work. But I wasn't going to put $500,000 of my, billing time at risk for some client I didn't even know in the renewable energy sector. No way. All right, so just to review, what were the 4 reasons civil engineers make horrible clients? Number 1, they think they know how to survey, just math, right? Number 2, they want to apply a formula to everything. Number 3, they will pressure you to cut corners when they're trying to win work because of price pressures. Number 4, they'll send you, toxic contract language and ridiculous payment terms. Land surveyors, don't accept any of that. Don't do it. Respect yourself, respect your profession, demand some dignity, demand reciprocity. It's hard. Now, we're going to talk about we can talk about it now. What's the consequences of taking a stand about this stuff and telling civil engineers, I'm not going to let you treat me like a $2 prostitute? You have to send me a reasonable contract language. You have to understand that there's nuance. You have to understand that my services are valuable, that this isn't just a math problem. You have to treat me like a first-class part of the design team. Keep me informed. Keep me in the loop. What's the consequence of that? I can tell you what the consequence is for my company, Redefine Horizons. We don't work for a lot of civil engineers. Most of our clients are not civil engineers, which surprised me when I started the company. I thought most of my clients would be civil engineers. They're not. We work for utility companies. We work for land attorneys. We work for land developers. We work for local government agencies direct. We do not work for a lot of civil engineers. There's a couple. We have 1 or 2 that we will occasionally do work for. But as a general rule, we don't work for civil engineers because of these problems. Right? And again, to review, this isn't about hating civil engineers. We are picking on them. I'm not going to lie. We're picking on them. I'm going to pick on surveyors in an upcoming episode just so civil engineers don't feel like they're being singled out. But we're picking on them because they don't treat us well as a profession and as individuals and as business owners. It's not because they're evil. It's not because they're bad people. Some of them are bad people, but most of them are good people. It's because of the financial incentives. It's because of the way our professions are structured in this economy. It's because we are a sibling profession. There is some hubris there. And this is just a consequence of that. Okay, but understanding that it's not malevolent, that it's not evil, that there isn't evil intent, doesn't mean it's not true. It's still true. We still have to deal with the consequences. And so you have to learn to protect your business from clients who undervalue your work, who push toxic contract language, who want to make you an accomplice in corner cutting when you know that's going to hurt ultimately it's going to harm the client or harm the public. You can't put up with that. Don't put up with that treatment. Of all the professions, civil engineers should treat us the best, not the worst. It should be the opposite. And you know who I ultimately blame for this situation? I don't blame the civil engineers. I blame the land surveyors that work for the civil engineers and put up with this treatment. They either work for the same organization as W-2 employees, or that contract with these companies and put up with this treatment. If more surveyors took a stand, this would be less of a problem. Right? Know your value, understand your worth, read your contracts, tell people the truth even when it's uncomfortable. Think about the long term, protect your project owners, right? Reduce problems in construction, do things the right way. If that means you can't work for civil engineers, don't work for civil engineers. As we close out the episode, we just want to give you guys a few reminders. First, we want to let you know where you can find the podcast episodes. The podcast home on the web is at my personal website, landonblake.com. If you head there and look under the Learn menu, you'll find a link for the podcast. That homepage for the podcast has all of the episodes. You can download those in MP3 format if you'd like, or read the show notes. You can also find the podcast on Spotify, YouTube, and Amazon Music. So if those are your preferred, one of those is your preferred distribution channel, you can find the podcast there. We also want to let you guys know, if you'd like to sponsor the podcast, you can reach out to me, sunburn.surveyor@gmail.com. You can also send me questions, comments, thank yous, topic suggestions for the podcast. I regularly get that kind of feedback from listeners, and I dig it. I appreciate hearing from you guys, so I encourage you to do that. We also have a Patreon page. If you cruise over to Patreon, you can search for On Point Workshops, and you will find the podcast there. You can, for a small monthly donation, I believe right now it's $10 a month, you can support the podcast and get access to what we call PYB OTM Extras. So those are extra videos, short audio files, and even full episodes of the podcast. And that support on Patreon allows me to keep Carly around. Carly is the fantastic young lady that helps me edit the podcast and maintain the podcast website. We'd like to keep her around, so we appreciate your support on Patreon if you're able to do that. And thank you for being a listener.